I think it was fantastic to see them really getting their heads into the training and the fact that they wanted to learn. And I think they also understood why they had to be good at what they were training for, because there was a realization that this really could happen.
So the risk of using acronyms or almost slang terms for certain pieces of equipment, etc., do not translate easily into other languages. And so being very mindful of that when you're presenting or passing on information.
Hello and welcome to Being Crisis Prepared, the BCP podcast from Invroy Crisis Management. And today I'm delighted to be joined by two new members of the team, Sarah and Stuart. First of all, Sarah, great to have you on board. Welcome to the team.
Thank you very much, Matthew. It's really great to be here and meet everyone.
And Stuart, I guess for you it's not welcome, it's welcome back. But from a podcast point of view, I think is this the first one you've done?
Well, firstly, Matthew, thank you. I think this is actually the second I've done, but it was a number of years ago. So good to be back and back in the podcast space as well.
Brilliant. In which case, as most of our listeners will now know, what we tend to do is try to do one or two news items that we've picked up that have a resilience angle of interest, and then perhaps a theme or a topic. So I know we've got a couple of news items to talk about, and all three of us were recently on a visit to a client in Senegal, and we have a couple of thoughts from working overseas as a consultant and things to consider, or something that jumped out. So that's the theme of today. A news topic. Stuart, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. I'm going to talk about the black dog, and it's not because I'm feeling particularly eloquent today, but for those that haven't heard, the Black Dog is a pub in central London in Vauxhall, which last Thursday found itself the focus of some social media activity that it wasn't expecting. It hadn't done anything wrong, but what it had become was the talking point for Swifties, the fans of Taylor Swift, who linked a song with the same name to that pub in London. And as a result, it's had considerable interest from those that like to visit the places that Taylor refers to and take an interest in her life. But the reason I brought it up as a topic for discussion is that response to something that you're not prepared for. Now, normally in the crisis management world, we're talking about bad things, sudden loss of business or the loss of a premise, for example. But in this case, this is a sudden interest and an influx of customers that you weren't expecting. And the knock-on from that is, of course, how do you respond? Firstly, probably with delight, but then you've got to get down to the hard work of looking at your supply chain, working out if you've got enough staff, do you need enough staff, etc. Go on, Matthew.
And I guess that change, that almost, was it overnight, this change? So no time to plan. You wake up the next morning and you see this in the news and go, uh-oh, it's going to be a busy day. So exactly like an emergency response, but this time it's an opportunity rather than a threat that you're trying to seize, but without losing the look and feel of the place for the locals, because you want to continue to provide what it is that they've been enjoying over all these years. What an interesting challenge for them is to how to either ride that wave or hope that wave continues and that people maintain that interest. So interesting.
Yeah.
Sarah, what do you think?
No, I was just going to agree with you. It's like how to manage the rapid growth down to popularity, social media interest, and also sustain it being good for business. And I know, Stuart, there's a couple of shows in London from Taylor Swift, and I think instead of having it fizzle out, it's like, how do you prolong that if it is going to be prolonged? How do you manage that over a long period of time? And just how you manage it in general with, as you were saying before, extra staff, reservations, space, etc., logistical impacts as more food, drink, etc. So I think it is, how do you manage the rapid growth?
Because I guess you can change quite a lot in pub management, but you can't change the physical bricks and mortar of the place. You can have a few more staff, or you can increase the delivery of your order for drinks, but you can't cook more meals or increase the license number of people allowed in the building from fire regulations, because the space is the space. So how do you do that without causing potential harm to people and then ruining your reputation of a good place to go, and you suddenly become overnight a bad place because we went to this bar and it was rubbish type thing on TripAdvisor or whatever. So Stuart, have you any ideas on things that if you were the manager of the Black Dog that you might be thinking about in anticipation for the summer tour, apart from obviously your tent pitch outside that you've I'm sure reserved as a Swiftie?
Absolutely. I think you just alluded to some of them there. So things like security, for example. If you are limited in space, you need some means of controlling the number of people that come through the door, particularly if you're a walk-in establishment rather than a pre-booked or table service establishment.
Yeah, I recently was lucky enough to go on one of those holidays that you always promise yourself. And we went to New York for a short week or a long weekend and went to a bar that's famous for the waiters and waitresses all being high caliber musical theatre singers. And they haven't quite made it to the top level, but to earn money, they're working in this breakfast diner. And it was packed first thing in the morning. And apparently all day it is packed because the singing was fantastic. And you're there going, hang on a second, am I actually in the theatre, or is, no, I can't be because I'm eating waffles and stuff. But they had a queuing system around the block that was very carefully managed. And so they didn't block off offices and build doors and accesses further down the line, and a security team to manage it. And on the other hand, I was in Greg's the other day, which is perhaps one extreme to the other. And that had a chain outside so that people queuing to get into Greg's would queue in the right way and not block other people's entrances. So yeah, that manage your footfall in a way that people know, how long is it going to take to get to the front of the queue from here, and all that sort of expectation management. So if they do turn around on TripAdvisor and say, oh, it's rubbish, I had to wait half an hour. Yes, we told you would, because when you joined the queue, you were at the area that said half an hour.
I think it's understanding the customers. As you alluded to there, you could have some people that wants their reservation for lunch because it's their regular place to visit on a Sunday afternoon, and they go there every Sunday afternoon as habit. And then you've got people that want to visit the place because it's in a Taylor Swift song. And I think it's managing the regular customers and the people that live locally in the area or have known about the pub before it became famous, and ensuring that they're still coming and you're managing both sets of customers or all customers in the correct way.
I would definitely say that for the recovery aspect, because at some point the Swifties will move on, and you need your regular clientele, and you've got to serve the quality product that they came to you in the first place for. So a big part of the recovery.
Okay, an interesting one to start us, and I know that we weren't quite sure whether we were going to do this one as a news topic or not, but Sarah, you've got a news topic as well from the other side of the world.
Yeah, it was in the news over the last couple of days, and it's basically about the Japanese companies recycling used nappies. So it's horizontal recycling, which means that they actually recycle the used nappies from individuals and are now selling them in shops and supermarkets, actually at a higher rate than normal nappies, but people are happy to pay the new and increased price because of sustainability and the recycling aspect behind it.
Is this for toddlers or not?
So because of the demographic crisis of Japan, their aging population means that a lot of the nappies are now being used for the older generation. And a couple of companies have actually come out after this article saying they are going to stop production and manufacturing of nappies for infants because the demand is just not there because of the population decline. And they're not seeing the amount of infants at all needed to basically keep the supply and demand chain up. So yeah, in terms of the demographic, these are predominantly recycled nappies for the older generation, not the young.
So on it's a topic that we've touched on a few times for the Scottish aging population, or certainly in the rural parts of Scotland, and the challenges that has of almost 21st century Highland clearances. Yeah, it's interesting to see it in reality and what that means to products in the shops and how we cope with that. And I obviously fully applaud the recycling of any good. That's got to be a good thing. But it's
But I
interesting
think
that
it's,
that's
yeah,
in the nappy world.
but it's impacting businesses throughout Japan. I would say that more the businesses and shops in the rural areas basically have no successors, which mean that no one's going to be taking over these businesses in a decade or so. So I think there is also something to think about. You're going to have a dying rural area on the outskirts of Japan, if you're not careful. And there have been government incentives, but unfortunately not picked up as much as I think the Japanese government would have liked them to.
Yeah, I was going to ask about those incentives, and are they purely financial, or is there a sort of drive to move industry and things like healthcare, schooling back out to the rural areas supported by government to make that population shift?
Currently, the Japanese government were giving a one-off $1,500 incentive for families to use. I think it was either per family or per child, and that was trying to get them to move to the rural areas. The only issue is with this, there's no employment in the rural areas, and if you do decide to become a successor of the business, some people were saying that it takes, 1 year to 2 years of purely training for that, in order to become the successor. And I think it's a lot about the risk in which you're willing to put, say a new family in, because the incentive only applies to people that are 18 years old, or families with children that are 18 years old and younger. So I think in terms of the reality, if they can't get employment and they're not wanting to be a successor of the business, they have to have a purely work remote job. And in terms of even one of, say, the parents get that, which would be great, it's the likelihood of two parents getting completely remote jobs in a rural area, which I would say that's probably one of the reasons why, unfortunately, there hasn't been as big an uptake as the Japanese government would like. I think in terms of the people that have taken the incentive, it's a drop in the ocean, compared to the 35 million people that actually live in Tokyo.
And I think, Matthew, as you hinted at earlier, that Japan is a bellwether of what's coming to many other countries, and the lessons that Japan's learning now are not too far in the future for certainly the UK and some other European nations.
Yeah, 100% agree that when you look at the financial challenges that's going to create for supporting that population, with fewer earners having to pay the pensions and healthcare for their parents' generation and grandparents' generation, well, how do you continue to sustain that quality of life without penalizing the younger generation, so that they then become disenfranchised or disgruntled and start to rebel against the whole process, and it then breaks up the whole fabric of the society if you're not going to care for your elderly? Yeah, but there are so many elderly. Where do you start and stop? And I think we've commented before that, is this generation going to be the first generation where mortality or average age of death goes down for the first time rather than goes up?
I think if you put, as Stuart asked earlier, if you put businesses and I would say more headquarters of companies in these rural areas, it will naturally attract people that are working in that company already. And I think the other thing is you could increase the salaries in rural areas, because one of the main attractions for living in big cities all over the world is a high earning opportunity. That's why younger people will go to cities, because there's exceptional education, higher earning opportunities. And I think if you just placed opportunities like that in rural areas, you would be able to have the younger generation earning, a high salary, whilst also being able to look after the older generation who don't necessarily want to move in to central Tokyo, and you've got the best of both worlds. But at the moment, I don't think the incentive is high enough, and the companies aren't currently moving to the rural areas where you could have best of both worlds.
And I'll get the figure wrong, but I think that the Scottish government has just opened up a fund to pay for examining the issues around this topic. And I think it was something like £180,000. And you think, that's a drop in the ocean. I think it funded, a post in Inverness and a post in Portree or Skye looking at the Highlands and Islands sort of thing of, well, by the time you've put a couple of people there, what are they actually going to do compared to proper grown-up investment? And it's the sort of thing in Scotland that Scottish Enterprise does, I think, to encourage international companies to come and do their research and development in Scotland. But it tends to be research and development in the Central Belt, not up in the northern part, sort of Inverness and north. Okay, so how do you encourage that shift? So no, interesting questions. But I think that whole topic of urbanization, aging population is one of the undercurrents at the moment that just comes up again and again and again on that succession planning. It's all very well having a highly educated population, but if you haven't got enough of them, what do you do? And then you get into well, you can get immigrant population from elsewhere. Well, okay, but if everyone's going through the same problem, eventually you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. It also neatly segues us into the third bit that I just wanted to talk about of our trip to Senegal. And I say that because while we were there, we looked at what the median age was for a few countries around the world. And in the UK, it was about 40 or 40.7, I think it was. So median being above that point is half the population, and below that point is half the population. So half the population is over 40.7 years old, and half the population is younger. The lowest figure in the world was Niger, Stuart, I think you found, which was
around 15.
15. So half the population is under 15. And in Senegal, it was
18.8 and increasing.
18.8. So half the population, if that was a UK population, half the population would still be at school. An interesting difference between what you've just described in Japan, where that's not the case. So there are a few countries in the world that are still very much on the younger age. And I think that was one of the things we picked up on our trip was the youth and energy of the employment market, where the average age in the office was probably early 30s, late 20s, and very hungry to learn and very positive. And one of the things that we had was a sort of induction brief on the company and health and safety, obviously, you turn up, but also on the culture of Senegalese and the idea that everyone is very polite, and people interrupting colleagues to say hello to each other and good morning and stuff was actually just nice and changed the atmosphere in an office completely, from some of the ones that I've worked in to being genuinely friendly and pleased to see people, rather than sometimes a bit adversarial even amongst your own colleagues. Sarah, conscious that this was your first trip with us, appreciate you're well traveled. What did you pick up on, and perhaps if you're able to relate it to any other travels that you've had or experiences, but what was it that you picked up on your first trip with us?
I think the thing that stood out most of all was, as you've mentioned before, is just the sheer enthusiasm and the incentive to learn for this group of people that we worked with. I think it was fantastic to see them really getting their heads into the training, and the fact that they wanted to learn because they had such an appetite for it. And I think they also understood why they had to be good at what they were training for, because there was a realization that this really could happen, instead of sometimes and scenarios I've done before where it's slightly an unrealistic scenario and people fight the scenario. You see it a lot, saying it's unrealistic, etc. I think a lot of the scenarios were realistic. People really related to it, and they wanted to educate themselves in the best way and how to move forward with a certain scenario. And they wanted to be the best at it. I think for such a young group of people, it was really fantastic to see just such an enthusiasm. And you're right, the way they built each other up, the way they interacted with each other, how respectful they were, and how willing to help. They really all got in with everything. So it was really great.
I appreciate you've lived in the French-speaking part of Canada, so your French is way better than my bonjour tout le monde or mange tout rodders type language skills. That anyone that knows me will go, that's not a high bar to set. But clearly, Senegal, the language isn't English. How did you find that worked?
I think that's very kind of you to say. My French is below average, but thank you. I think the fact that their English was exceptional was very helpful. But I know we've mentioned before the different versions of English. We're extremely lucky. Our native language is the predominant language in many countries and as a business language as well. But I think it's getting used to the different versions of English and the way you interact. I also think as well that it shouldn't be assumed that every single person, i.e. that works within the Senegalese team, speaks French, because there were some individuals that didn't speak the local language of French as well. And also just different languages, such as tribal languages, other local languages, etc. So I think it was great to see everyone working together in English, but also as a consideration that it's not just the first language of the country being French or the native business language being English. It's also other dialects that you have to consider in every single scenario, and how exhausting it does get speaking in different languages as well. I can say that from my own personal experience.
And I think also when you're talking about potentially technical subjects, if that be emergency response or just the nature of the oil and gas industry, so the risk of using acronyms or almost slang terms for certain pieces of equipment, etc., do not translate easily into other languages. And so being very mindful of that when you're presenting or passing on information.
Absolutely. And Sarah, your point about language. So I think the company we were with said that they had representatives from 17 different nationalities, which even if half of them are different, and I know in the team that we were directly working with, Portuguese was one of the first languages, French, obviously. So you've got a Portuguese speaker speaking English. They're all slightly different. When you mix that all in together, what people think they're saying isn't necessarily the same as what someone else is hearing. And by the time the person hearing it has worked out what they were saying, conversations moved on 2 or 3 sentences and you've lost it. So maintaining situational awareness can be really difficult. Yeah.
I think that kind of aligns interestingly with communications as well, and to make sure that there is a clear line whilst speaking, because it makes it even harder if you don't have 2 native English speakers who, if you don't get a full sentence, you get the gist of what they're trying to say. But if you have different versions of English and you also have a broken line, not a great signal, or you're moving about and there's, say, traffic in the background or drilling, etc., it makes it even harder to understand. So I think having quite an emphasis on good communications as well is something to really, really consider.
Yeah, no, that clarity of what you mean and the ability to hear it. No, it's a great point. And pretty much we were blown away by how good they were. But when you see how good a team can be, you then realize that not everyone is going to be that good. And I think, isn't it us and the Americans that say it's 2 countries divided by a common language? We're similar, but we're not quite the same, and therefore it's different. And one of the team gave me an example in Senegal. He said someone was describing, oh, can you pass the snips? And he said, I haven't got a clue what he meant. What are snips? Right, turns out they're pliers. Well, if he'd have said, pass me the pliers, I'd have passed him the pliers, but he wasn't. He was using a slang phrase, pass me the snips. Say what you mean, be clear. And Stuart, it's your thing for communications, isn't it? The ABCs of communications that you've taught me of accuracy, brevity, and clarity that if you can get that right, it just helps when it's not your first language.
I think it's also in your subconsciousness when you use slang, because occasionally you use it every single day, and actually having a conscious decision to say pliers instead of snips is something that may not come naturally to some people. And it's kind of training yourself to make the conscious decision to use, say, not slang. And I think it is something that is not as easy as it sounds as well.
Yeah. And the number of times you hear a conversation and you think, if you'd have slowed down and thought about it, you wouldn't have used that phrase, you'd have used something else. Or, you know, in the modern world, you go into some places and every sentence is punctuated by swear words, you know, in the business, in the workplace. Well, it doesn't have to be.
I think we are encouraging people to assess our own podcast, Matthew, with our accuracy, brevity, and clarity.
Yeah, it is a dangerous thing. And I am very conscious that I am absolutely no saint and probably tiptoeing towards one of the worst when it comes to slang and you know, the phrases that I use, and probably too many ums and ers and so on. But there we go. There's another. It is what it is. And provided that we do our best and recognize that sometimes the person who may be looking slightly confused at our topic isn't confused because of the topic. They're confused because of the language that we've used to try and ask the question in the first place, and you know, sort of dressing back and thinking about the right words and then rephrasing it, not doing the normal British thing of just saying it louder. Stuart, what about your observation from our trip?
Yeah, I firstly thoroughly enjoyed the trip and agree with everything that Sarah highlighted. I was observing on something else though, and I've got a little bit of a background in maritime search and rescue. And I was considering the challenges of setting up a new technical industry in a relatively remote part of the world, and how, whilst there is 50 years plus experience of oil production offshore from the North Sea and previously, some of the facilities that we've come to expect as normal don't exist everywhere. And so, for example, in an emergency situation where you're having to get somebody from offshore back to a place of safety and potentially for serious medical treatment, we don't always have the luxury of a full trauma center just over an hour's flight from whichever platform you've had your incident on. So the experience here was that some injuries would not be able to be treated ashore in Senegal and would require a repatriation CASEVAC flight back to potentially South Africa or France, which considerably adds to the patient pathway. We talk about the golden hour and the importance of fast action. Having to do that long kind of flight is going to add to that and ultimately not be the best thing for the patient. And then along with that, there are considerations as to how do you manage the family of that individual? Do they need to travel to France to visit them in hospital? Do you send representatives from your company? And how do you equip them to be able to deal with managing a casualty in a very different part of the world from where most of your business is established?
Yeah, it just complicates everything, doesn't it? And it's not just the onward transmission from the heliport or the first hospital you go to in Senegal to the more advanced care in South Africa or Paris, but just the resilience of your helicopter to get from the rig or platform FPSO to land in itself. Well, what if the helicopter's not flying because the weather conditions are wrong? What if that, you know, there's a spare parts issue? So I'm pretty certain at the moment the S-92 helicopter is having, I think it's gearbox problems. So the supply chain is struggling, which means that there are fewer helicopters. Well, if you don't have a diverse helicopter fleet, or you don't have many helicopters full stop, it doesn't take many to not be available, and you don't have your initial medevac, let alone your onwards medevac. So in that sort of embryonic stage for, in this case, oil and gas production in Senegal, you really are sort of reliant on that you've got has to work, because there aren't 5 of them, there are 2 of them. And therefore it's a slightly different world that we were used to in the northeast Scotland, sort of northern North Sea area, where there are 3 search and rescue helicopters that can be called on. Is it Inverness, Aberdeen, Shetland?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. So all of which, don't get me wrong, there are better options to choose depending on where your incident occurs. But in an emergency situation, you're not reliant on one search and rescue helicopter, and potentially on top of that, you can then down man with other helicopters and so on. So, but you're right, that onward care does start to make a difference, doesn't it? So, yeah, Sarah, did you have any thoughts on that?
The longevity of the onward care as well is for everyone involved. How big a pool of people do you need? What other assets do you need? And just people's own mental health and well-being along with this it is a huge operation to do that, and something to consider, which in the heat of the moment may not necessarily be everyone's first instinct to think about it. But I think it is, yeah, you're right, the longevity and how long it actually lasts.
Yeah. So if you've got a serious casualty that needs to be cared for in a different country, it's not going to be a couple of days, it's going to be a while, which therefore takes people out of your ability to use them for their day job, which then puts extra pressure on other people, or means some things won't get done in the same time frame. Just at the moment that you're trying to recover from a significant incident, you now are losing one or many people in order to be able to care for that. And I say that on the back of incident in the Gulf of Mexico with Pemex, the Mexican state company that had 1 dead and 8 serious burns injuries. Well, if you've now got 9 serious casualties, and Pemex is huge, so slightly different scale, but that does have an impact on your ability to do the day-to-day business of your company, especially if they're supporting injured people in different countries and potentially different time zones and different currencies and all the rest of it. It just creates friction.
Each individual case is so specific to that person and that company liaison representative. I think some people could or would need more support than others because of the injured person or person's own support system. If you say have your own family that can provide an exceptionally good support system, you may, I would say, lean less on the company representative than if you unfortunately didn't have a support system, where you'd probably lean more, even though your situations and the injuries could be the same. I think it's what each individual needs is so specific to their own persons.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on this version of Being Crisis Prepared. I hope that you've enjoyed the chance to join us on our latest edition, and I hope that you enjoyed the trip to Senegal. Personally, a tabletop, 3 SEMEXs, 2 courses, and a journey back, leaving at 21:40, flying through the night, was hard work. So I'm grateful for your company on the trip, and long may that relationship continue and that we get a chance to do many more of them. But for now, thank you for your time on the podcast. Until next time.